Today I'm going to show you how to create a colorful coastal textured art painting. And if you're completely new to textured art, this might look like it's difficult, but it's actually quite beginner friendly and you don't need a lot of materials to do that. And I'm going to walk you through step by step what materials are required, how to prepare the surface, how we apply the textures, how to paint the artwork, and then we're going to have a look at the finished painting. And for those of you who are new to the channel, my name is Henry, also known as Textuuri. I've been doing textured art full-time for 4 years. I post my artwork across all the main social media channels. And in addition to the content, I sell my own artwork, I do online workshops, and I have my own line of art supplies. Let's begin by going over the materials we're going to need. We'll be creating our painting on a pre-primed stretched cotton canvas. This is 40 by 50 centimeters in size. And for the textures, we're going to be using my own brand of smooth texture paste. For the colors, we only need 3 different ones. I have titanium white and raw umber. These will form the beach section. And then I have Prussian blue. And together with the white paint, we'll use these to paint the ocean. Then optionally, if you want to do the white edges like I will, we have masking tape. Then we'll need a paintbrush for painting and a palette knife for doing the textures. And optionally, we can use a piece of sponge or just a regular kitchen sponge to add some details to the artwork. So if you have one available, you can use that. If not, we can get by with just the palette knife. And then completely optional, I'm going to use a pencil and a stamp to sign the artwork in the back. And then I have some washed and dried quartz sand to add a little extra coarseness to our beach. And we'll be mixing our colors on top of a palette, or this is actually a tile from a bathroom, but you could use an actual palette, lid of a plastic container, or whatever surface you have. So these were optional, and this is the bare minimum we're gonna need. So paste, paints, palette knife, brush, and the canvas. And I've listed and linked all the materials used in the description, so you can find the full material list from there. And as the first step, I'm just going to tighten the canvas slightly with the canvas wedges that were included with the canvas. If your canvas didn't come with these, then don't worry about it. If it did, it's good to use them. Then I'll give the wedges a quick tap. The canvas is now tight enough. Then I'll quickly stamp it and sign the back. And I'm going to call this coastal line. And because we're going to use masking tape around the edges and we're going to be painting the textures, we're going to take a little precaution by first covering the edges of the canvas. So I'm going to start by painting the edges white, because the white we have over here is different than the white here in the middle. And if during the creation of our artwork we get some paint or paste bleeding here, we could just easily spot fix that mistake rather than us having to paint all the edges and being careful not to hit the middle part. So doing this now in advance is a lot quicker than doing it once we are otherwise finished with the painting. And the paint layer stops roughly here, so we went a bit further than where our tape will be to prevent us accidentally leaving some blank spots in the edges. So it's better to paint a bit too much than a bit too little. And now we're going to wait for a few minutes for the acrylic paint to dry. The paint is now dry, and next we're going to apply the masking tape. And I'm simply measuring it by eye, so the bottom section of the tape to the bottom section of the canvas. And then we're just going to quickly push down on the edge of the tape to ensure it's properly stuck. And then we'll use the leftover paint to further seal the tape. So I'm just applying a thin layer of paint overlapping the tape and the canvas. And while we give the paint a few minutes to dry, we can prepare our texture paste. And if you watched any of my other videos, you probably know that the first thing we always do whenever we are using texture paste is we give it a good thorough mix inside the jar. Now it's smooth like this. And there are a few different ways we could create the textured waves. If we want to use just a little texture paste, we can grab some on our palette knife and just lay down the edge of the wave like this. And we could then repeat the pattern across the entire canvas. And by leaving these middle parts without texture paste, we're going to save a bunch of materials. So if we prefer lighter textures in our artwork, that's the way we could do it. Or alternatively, if we prefer a bit more textures, we can grab a bunch on our palette knife and then we start pulling it across the canvas, and you can see the wave, or the top of the wave, is starting to form. And then when we reach the point where we want it to stop, I'll just tilt the blade around 45 degrees and pull back. And then we'd cover behind the wave with some texture paste, and we would repeat the pattern behind it if we want to create several rows of the waves, so something like this. And then we would repeat the same pattern across the canvas. And there are also some other techniques we could use to create the waves. We could, for example, take a piping bag and do thin lines of texture, and then with a paintbrush or palette knife pull it down to form the wave. But to keep it fairly simple, we're gonna go with the second option I showed. And if you first want to sketch down the composition line, so where the waves will form, we can do that with a pencil and then fill the paste on top. So our waves could form something a bit like this. Here's the beach, here's the ocean, there's the first wave. Then we'll go for a second line, and we can just do this fairly roughly. We don't have to exactly follow our sketch if you don't want to. And I think I'll add a third one, something like this. And I'm feeling a bit playful, so I might do a wave a bit like this. Then we can start applying the textures. So I'm just pulling with my palette knife, roughly filling where the sketch line is. Especially with this design, you're quite easily tempted to creating too thick textures, and it's safe to apply the texture paste roughly 1 centimeter, maybe even up to 2 in thickness without the fear of cracking. But here we might easily make it a bit too thick and might see some minor cracks. So it's just useful to take note of that and not spread the paste too thick. And we'll just quickly go over the sketch line here, just taking a bit of paste at each go. And one of the things that makes textured art so beginner friendly is that it's very easy to reset and go again. So if we made a mistake with our paste, or we're just not happy with, for example, the composition or the pattern, we could just scrape off the paste and do it again. We have the top of the first wave, and now I'm going to fill in behind it, and this part of the texture can be even thinner. So this part will be the sort of foam that forms behind waves. And I want these lines to move roughly to the same direction as our waves. So not like this, but roughly to the same direction. We'll just quickly even it slightly out. And then it's time to take our sponge, or if you don't have a sponge, I'm going to show you how to use the flat end of the palette knife as well. But if you have the sponge, I'm just going to tap gently behind here to create the foam of the waves. With the palette knife, I would just press flat like this, maybe do some lines, maybe drag it across slightly like this, light tapping to lift the textures up and pulling it like this. So just to give the surface a bit more structure, we could even do both. So first, for example, go with the palette knife like this, and then we could take the sponge and add some extra details, something like that. And then I'm going to proceed to the next wave. Again, be careful not to lay the textures too thick, and that we follow our sketch roughly, and that we cover all of the blank parts. If it's really warm where you're working, you might want to grab some texture paste on your canvas and then close the lid to ensure moisture stays inside the jar and your texture paste jar stays good and fresh for a longer period of time. Because the paste is water-based, we want to maintain moisture and avoid it drying out in the jar. Let's keep the lid closed. Then I'll just fill the back part of the waves. And then we could again, for example, use the palette knife, drag it slightly, and you can see the difference. This is fairly flat, but if we drag slightly, we can get some extra interest and depth to it. This will especially pop out when we're going to paint over it. And some extra light details with the sponge. We don't have to go over all of the parts, something like that. And then we finish the remaining parts with texture. I actually filled this part a bit too quick. Now this is a bit more difficult to fill, so we're just gonna do it like this. And this again shows why textured art is so beginner friendly and flexible, is that if you make any mistakes or want to go back and change things up, it's quite easy to do so. Then we again pull with the knife a bit and add some of that structure here and do the final lap with the sponge. And the textured part is now finished. Now we're gonna let the textured portion dry, and just to be safe, I'm gonna wait around 24 hours, although it might dry a bit quicker. But before you paint on top of your textures, you always wanna ensure they're fully dry. But given my slightly impatient nature, I'm gonna be painting the first layer of the beach section now, while the textures are still wet. So I will take some raw umber acrylic paint, titanium white, and we'll mix that. And if we want to add that extra bit of coarseness to our sand, I'm using cleaned quartz sand to add some structure to the paint. Then we just mix it in. This is completely optional. We could also add some texture with the texture paste to the beach if you don't want to use the sand. Then we take the paintbrush and we start applying the paint on the canvas. And depending on your own preferences, we could keep the sand in just a single color, or we could layer it similarly as we plan on layering this to have multiple different tints of the same neutral beige. And now that the textures are still wet, I'm just going to be extra careful not to hit them too much. So I'm just pushing the paintbrush slightly to the canvas and gently moving it forward so we get paint in all the parts, but we don't mess up with the textures. And then let's get the brush marks in the right direction. And also, depending on your preferences, we could add more or less sand. Now, as you can see, the sand is fairly irregular, but we could add a lot more if we wanted to. And it took just a few minutes for this paint layer to dry, and the coverage is slightly uneven, so we're gonna quickly paint over it again. So just like before, grab some paint on your brush and then we just apply it on the canvas. And now that we're done with the paint and before the textures dry, we're going to remove the masking tape. If you prefer your artwork fully neutral, we could just let the textures dry, let the beach dry and call it finished. But we are going to paint over the waves with the blue and white. It's now been about 20 hours since we did the textures and they're now fully dry and we can start painting it. And you can easily test if your texture paste is dry by pressing down with your finger and tapping. And that hard tapping noise we heard means they're properly dry. And just that we don't have to be as careful with the white edges, I'm gonna apply the tape again. And I'm just gonna slide it close all the way to the textures like so. And make sure to get it all the way to the textured so we don't leave any gaps. Otherwise, we're going to get the paint on our white edge. So I like to wiggle it like this until we are all the way to the textures and then we just press it down like so. And then as another precaution, I'm going to take the white paint and we're going to seal the masking tape again. The paint again dried fairly quickly. And next I'm going to grab some of the Prussian blue. I'll quickly wipe some of the excess white from the paintbrush and then we start painting with the darkest, so the pure Prussian blue. And the way I want the color to be is that we have the darkest bits in the back or in the top of the canvas, and the closer we get to the shore, the lighter the blue gets. And we don't need to color all of the textures fully. We can leave some white peeking through already, so no need to go for full coverage. If you get just purely blue here, don't worry, we're gonna highlight those textures, so the tips of the foam with white paint in later layers. When I get close to the edge of the tape and the paste, although we sealed it with white acrylic, I rather keep my brush work fairly light rather than doing like this, so that we minimize the chance of the paint bleeding under the tape. And it's not looking like much just yet, but trust the process and keep layering the paints. And I'm going all the way to the bottom of these tips of the waves, whatever we call them. And for the part that's closest to the beach, I'll just grab some of the blue and then very lightly tip my brush also into the white, and it starts to tint it down slightly. So you can see this is already a bit lighter than these layers in the back. And in addition to the blue paint, another color that would work quite nicely here is green, and doing different tints of green. And my brush still has some blue paint on it, so I'm now just grabbing white so we can get clearly lighter part here closest to the shore. And it doesn't have to look perfect just yet because we're going to be adding more paint layers on top. So now we're just trying to block in the main colors. And we have our rough first layer, and I'm going to start adding this lighter blue here already on top, even though this paint here is still slightly wet. So I'm just tapping with my paintbrush slightly here. The top layer is already almost completely dry, and now we're going to tint down the Prussian blue just slightly and do another layer here. We'll get some here on the waves as well, a little bit of white. And same over here, some color on the top of the wave, and then some slightly lighter details in the back. And if you feel like it's getting maybe a bit too light, we can always just grab some more of the pure Prussian blue and add it over here. And then we'll continue the process here to the middle part. I'm using maybe a tad bit lighter paint here on the top of this wave. And the closer we get to the shore, the more careful we have to be not to get the blue paint here. The beach, although if that happens, don't worry about it. We can just try to wipe it off with a wet towel or wait for it to dry and then paint the beach again. So mistakes happen, we can just fix them when they do. I'm just taking white on my brush that already has the blue paint. And now we can see this bit is a bit more lighter than here. So I'm gonna come back here for a second run, make it just a bit lighter so it matches the other end. And then we're going to again wait 2-3 minutes while that layer dries, and then we're gonna do another layer of paint on top. And at this point, I'm going to start detailing my wave line here in the back. So I'm gonna grab just some white paint and start applying it here. And we can get some paint here on the other side of the waves as well, sort of foam. So it doesn't matter if you get some paint on that side. Same over here. I'll wipe the excess white from my brush. Then we take again some of that blue, and then I'm gonna do probably one of our final layers here in the back. And after that, we're gonna highlight those textures with white again, with a slightly different brushwork, but let's see if this will be enough for the ocean part. And then a quick few minutes for it to dry, and then we're going to detail and highlight these textures with just white. I'd want the whites to be quite white, so I'm going to give my brush a quick rinse and then just wipe it. Doesn't have to be completely clean, but I'm trying to get most of the blues out. And what we'll then do is I'm going to take just a bit of white, and if you get too much, just wipe some of it off. And laying the brush flat, I'm going to start detailing these textures over here. As we did the textured layer over here, and we have those peaks of texture paste, the paint sticks to those quite nicely. So we're basically just dry brushing and dragging the brush and getting some of that paint stuck on those tips of the textures. I'll also fix these parts a bit better because now they looked quite bad. So we want to blend that tip of the wave to the ocean part a bit more. And here you can see quite nicely how having very little paint and then just dry brushing, holding the paintbrush fairly flat, just highlights these peaks of the textures. And here I'm just making the transition from the ocean to the white foamy wave a bit more smooth. So rather than it jumping straight from blue to white, I'm going to drag the paintbrush here and make the white part a bit longer and more towards the ocean. And then as we push with the already almost dry brush, we are going to highlight those textures we created with the sponge and the flat end of the palette knife. And if you want to make them pop out just a bit more, we can grab a bit more white and very gently highlight some of the peaks over here. Now I'm just making a mess. And then the one closest to the shoreline, I'm going to make the waves first more white. Now that the waves are white, we're going to do the same thing we did earlier, which is sort of push the waves more towards the ocean with the white so that the transition from the blue to the white foamy waves is smoother. And as we're now closer to the shoreline, I'm going to make this slightly longer and slightly more white. And then finally, we're going to highlight some of these peaks of textures we have. With this part, I'm fairly happy. This one turned out a bit too light, so we can just always go back and fix any mistakes we made or anything we don't actually like. So I'm taking some blue here and making this top part a bit darker. Then it's time to remove the tapes from around the painting and see if we got any of the paint bleeding underneath. And I almost sort of hope that we got some paint bleeding underneath, so I can also show you how to fix it if that happens to you as well. So far it's looking pretty good. Okay, at least on this side our tape held. And what about here? Okay, also held, no bleeding. And the tape held here as well, so no fixing it today, but basically if we had some paint bleeding underneath, I would just take paintbrush, white paint, and then carefully painting it again. Remember to check out the description where I listed all the materials we used, and I also linked my blog there, and in it you will find more guides, articles and tutorials on how to create textured art. And I also share exclusive tips and techniques and updates on whenever I'm doing live painting sessions online, and if you're interested in that, you can sign up with your email on the page as well.